They called her the widow of Coldwater Creek, a woman whose voice carried less than the creak of her rocking chair. After her husband's death, she raised two small grandchildren in a house where curtains stayed drawn and windows reflected nothing but candlelight. Neighbors whispered that she sang lullabies long past midnight, rocking until the wood moaned like a coffin lid. When the children stopped appearing in town, no one dared to ask where they had gone, but the truth was waiting in that house, heavy as the silence she kept. Eliza Mae Holloway sat on her porch in the waning Mississippi sun, her figure framed against the sagging wood of the farmhouse that had outlasted both war and plague. Her hands, thin and spotted, curled around the armrests of the rocking chair, moving it back and forth in a rhythm so steady it seemed like prayer. The neighbors passing by always offered polite nods, but their eyes lingered too long on the chair, as though they expected it to stop, if only they stared hard enough. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and smoke, but also of something faintly sweet, like milk left too long on the hearth. Eliza lived alone now, or so people believed, but she would tell anyone who asked that her two grandchildren, Samuel and Clara, were her joy and her reason for waking each morning. Yet their laughter never drifted across the fields, their footsteps never sounded on the dirt road, and their faces, once seen at church and school, had not been glimpsed for many months. Eliza explained away their absence with practiced ease. They were delicate, prone to fevers, needing rest and her constant tending. Still, there was something unshakable about the quiet that hung in her home, as if it swallowed every sound but the creak of wood and the murmur of her voice. She kept a cradle near the fireplace, too large for children of their age, but it never left its place. Those who stepped inside swore they heard it shift, the wood sighing as if rocked by unseen hands, though Eliza never acknowledged it. She would only smile, her lips thin, her eyes shadowed by lashes that seemed too heavy with secrets. At night, the lantern on her porch glowed faintly, swaying though there was no wind, and her humming floated over the fields, a lullaby with no words, just a sound that pressed against the ears like a weight. Some said the tune was meant to soothe, but others felt their hearts race and their skin prickle with unease whenever they caught the drifting melody. Children in the town had begun to dare each other to walk past the Holloway place after dark, and though most turned back, those who lingered swore they saw small faces in the upstairs window, pale and watchful. When they returned to tell the tale, no one believed them, but all agreed on one thing: the Holloway house was too still, and the widow within it was not as alone as she claimed. The Holloway farmhouse sat at the bend of Coldwater Creek, like a stone placed in the path of time, its shutters warped, and its porch sagging, but still upright as if clinging to a duty it could not abandon. People passing by would lower their voices without realizing it, their words falling softer, as though sound itself did not belong inside those walls. It was not only that the house was old, or that Eliza Mae Holloway kept her curtains drawn tight against the sun. It was the absence of something expected, the lack of noise that should have belonged to children. Samuel and Clara had once been glimpsed darting through the fields, Samuel with his knees scraped from climbing too high, and Clara with ribbons fluttering in her hair. But those days were spoken of as though they belonged to another lifetime. Now there were no shouts from the yard, no quick patter of bare feet across the boards, only the steady groan of the rocking chair on the porch and the faint thrum of lullabies hummed long after dusk. Those who lingered near the fence swore the silence inside was unnatural, not simply the quiet of a lonely home, but a silence that pressed outward, smothering crickets and stilling the night birds. It was as if the air around the Holloway place grew heavy, carrying a weight that stole breath and left the skin clammy. Neighbors spoke of how dogs refused to linger near the steps, their hackles raised and their bodies pressed low, and how children ran past with their eyes closed, too frightened to look at the windows for fear of what might be staring back. One woman, bringing over a basket of food, claimed she heard a faint tapping from within, like the sound of fingernails brushing along wood. But when she asked Eliza about it, the widow simply smiled with a softness that felt rehearsed and closed the door with deliberate care. At night, when the lantern burned in the upper room, The rocking chair would move, though no hand touched it, its creak slow and steady, like the breath of something unseen. The silence, punctuated only by that rhythm, seemed to seep into the bones of anyone who listened too long, filling their minds with thoughts they dared not say aloud. And yet, despite the unease, no one confronted Eliza directly, for she carried herself with such calm certainty that to accuse her felt like blasphemy. They told themselves the children were inside, asleep, perhaps too ill to play, but each time they passed and saw the stillness hanging heavy over the house, the truth pressed closer. There was no laughter to soften the quiet, no voices to break the air. The Holloway home had become a place where sound went to die, where rocking wood and whispered song were the only proofs of life, and where the silence itself seemed to be watching, waiting, guarding whatever Eliza kept within. Samuel and Clara Holloway were not born to the quiet, though they were carried into it soon enough. Their parents had been taken by the rails, a night train that never reached its station, leaving behind twisted metal, scorched wood, and the small shapes of two children who had survived by chance alone. Eliza Mae, their grandmother, took them in without hesitation, though some wondered if the taking in had been duty more than love. The town remembered the day she led them up the dirt road toward her farmhouse, Samuel clutching a satchel far too heavy for his thin arms, Clara dragging a doll by its hair until the mud swallowed its face. They had looked like children, bound for a new start, but their eyes already carried the shadow of the wreck that had stolen their parents. In the early months, there were glimpses of them at church, sitting stiffly beside their grandmother, their faces pale against the black veil she never removed, their voices never raised in song with the others. At school, Samuel tried to play with the other boys but grew quiet when asked too much about the accident, while Clara would sit alone in the corner, humming to herself and plaiting her hair into uneven braids, as though listening to something no one else could hear. Their absence from the schoolhouse soon became regular, explained away by Eliza as frailty of health, the fevers of children who needed their grandmother's tender hand more than arithmetic or recitation. The teacher accepted it at first, but as the weeks stretched into months, the children became little more than memories, names on a roll call no longer answered. The neighbors tried to bring cheer to the Holloway place with gifts of preserves or bread, hoping to coax Samuel and Clara into daylight, but the baskets returned untouched, or worse, half-eaten, as if by small bites that never satisfied. Sometimes, late in the evening, shapes were seen behind the curtain of the upstairs window, fleeting as candle smoke, a boy and girl peering down at the road only to vanish the moment a passerby lifted their gaze. Stories began to twist through the town that Samuel had grown pale as chalk, that Clara no longer spoke, that the two had become as silent as the house that held them. The most troubling whisper came from a farmhand who claimed to have heard Eliza rocking the cradle by the fire, singing low and sweet, while two voices, faint as sighs, tried to join her but faltered into silence. The orphaned children, once pitied for their loss, became figures of unease, their absence a wound in the fabric of the community, and though the townsfolk longed to ask what had become of them, they never pressed Eliza, for her eyes, when fixed upon them, held the finality of earth already turned over a grave. In time, Samuel and Clara became less like children and more like phantoms of what had been remembered only in whispers that carried uneasily down Coldwater Creek. The cradle by the Holloway fireplace was older than Eliza Mae herself, its wood carved by hands long buried, its legs smoothed by the slow rub of generations, rocking children to sleep. It had cradled her own sons and daughters, had lulled fevered babies through long Mississippi nights, and had held silence as easily as it once held song. Yet the cradle never left its place, not even when Samuel and Clara outgrew its small frame. Visitors found it strange, for it sat too close to the fire, the quilts folded within it, stitched in patterns of black thread and red crosses, as though made for ceremony rather than warmth. Some swore they saw it move on its own, swaying with a rhythm too steady to be the draft, the creak of its legs echoing faintly, even when Eliza's hands were nowhere near. When asked, she would only smile and say, A child never grows too old to be rocked, her voice hushed as though afraid to wake something. Samuel had once been seen curled within it, knees bent against his chest, his eyes wide and unblinking as his grandmother stroked his hair and hummed her wordless tune. Clara, too, had lain in it, her small hands clutching the edge as though afraid to slip away, her lips moving as if repeating the lullaby no one else understood. But as time passed and the children disappeared from public sight, only the cradle remained in plain view, an anchor of uneasy familiarity in the dim Holloway parlor. Neighbors who stepped inside with gifts or messages always noticed it first, their eyes drawn to the carved wood, the stains that darkened its base, the smell of lavender, and something sour lingering about it. The rocking never stopped. Even when the room was empty, the cradle tilted as though bearing weight, and the air above it seemed pressed down, disturbed by invisible motion. Rumors spread that the cradle no longer held children, but held their absence, rocking what was gone as if to keep it close. Some claimed that when the firelight flickered, shadows appeared within it, small figures that shifted with the sway. Others whispered that Eliza spoke to it in low tones, as though bargaining with something resting there, something that refused to release what it had claimed. The cradle became less a piece of furniture than a presence in the Holloway house, a silent sentinel that bore witness to the children's vanishing. No matter how the seasons turned, it never gathered dust, never lost its shine, as though polished by unseen hands. It was said that one evening, a neighbor's boy slipped close to the Holloway porch and peered through the cracked window. What he saw sent him running home, his face white as linen. He swore the cradle rocked violently, though no one touched it, and inside lay not children, but two small mounds wrapped tight in quilts stitched with red. His story was dismissed as fancy, but no one could shake the image once told. The cradle remained by the fire, steady, eternal, and waiting. On Sunday mornings, the church bell tolled over Coldwater Creek, its iron song rolling across the fields and calling every soul to kneel beneath the rafters. The pews filled with families dressed in their best, children squirming, mothers shushing, fathers nodding solemnly toward the pulpit. Yet one family was never whole. Eliza Mae Holloway came alone, her black veil pulled low, her hands folded like claws of bone around a leather Bible that seemed older than the church itself. The space beside her remained empty, though it had once been filled by two pale faces, Samuel and Clara, who now existed only in memory. When the congregation rose to sing, their voices rising in hymns meant to pierce heaven. Eliza's lips moved, but no words came. She mouthed something no one recognized, her jaw shaping syllables that slipped beyond comprehension, as though she prayed to a tongue too ancient for the others to grasp. Some noticed the rhythm of her movements, almost like the steady sway of her rocking chair, each breath carrying a cadence, not aligned with the hymn, but with some hidden measure. She alone followed. The pastor, a man weary with decades of tending to stubborn hearts, would glance at her often, his sermon stumbling when her eyes met his. There was nothing wild in them, no spark of madness, only a calm that unsettled, the calm of a woman who knew something the rest dared not speak aloud. After service, when families lingered in the yard to trade gossip or blessings, Eliza slipped away without pause, her black figure cutting across the grass like a shadow detached from the Sunday. People whispered that she prayed longer than any of them, staying long after others had gone, kneeling in her pew as the candles guttered and the light dimmed. Some swore they heard her humming, the same lullaby she crooned at home, drifting low across the wooden beams until even the doves in the rafters fell quiet. What unsettled them most was the absence of her grandchildren, for children were the life of the church, their laughter filling the aisles, their mischief testing patience and faith alike. Without Samuel and Clara, the Holloway pew felt like a wound, a gap that never closed. The excuses had been whispered enough times to dull their sharpness, illness, frailty, the need for rest. But as the months stretched on, belief thinned. More than once, a child in the congregation asked aloud where the Holloway children were, their innocent questions silenced by a mother's hand or a father's stern hush. Still, the thought lingered like smoke in every mind. Eliza's prayers, secret and silent, seemed to throb with weight, as if she prayed not for salvation, but for something darker, some keeping of what should have been released. And when the hymnals closed and the families dispersed, the church seemed to exhale in relief, once she had gone, as though even its walls felt the burden of her silence and the ghosts that followed her from pew to porch. The Holloway farmhouse sat higher than most on the bend of Coldwater Creek, its roofline just visible above the trees when the moon was full, and at night it became a beacon for all the wrong reasons. For though the other farmsteads went dark after supper, their windows black and still as the families inside surrendered to sleep, the Holloway place burned with a strange glow. It was not the steady flame of a lamp in the window or the soft flicker of a candle. It was the lantern, swaying on the porch, its light too bright, too restless, as if it had a will of its own. Neighbors who rose early for chores, or who lingered too long by their fences, claimed to see it night after night, a small, pulsing fire in the distance, marking the house like a watchtower. On some evenings the lantern light bobbed gently, as if cradled by the wind, though no breeze touched the fields. On others, it swayed in jagged bursts, a pendulum gone mad, and with it came the faint thread of sound carried on the night air. It was not words but humming, the shape of a lullaby without melody, repeated again and again until it settled into the mind like a weight. A farmer passing by after midnight swore that he heard not just one voice but three, the widow's low and steady, and two others faint, like children half asleep, echoing her song. He stopped in the road, his heart hammering, his lantern raised, and he watched as the glow on the Holloway porch dimmed, then flared, as though answering his breath. He did not wait to see more. By morning, when he told his wife, he was already pale with shame for speaking it aloud. The lantern became a subject of whispers at the general store, with some claiming it was nothing more than a widow's comfort, a light to keep the dark at bay, and others certain it was a signal, though none could say to whom. One boy, reckless with curiosity, crept close enough to the Holloway fence to see it for himself. He later swore the lantern was not hung from the porch at all, but seemed to float just above the steps, swaying, though no hand touched it. He ran home, tears in his eyes, insisting that, as he turned away, he heard the creak of the rocking chair and the faintest murmur of a lullaby following him into the night. The town began to mark its hours by that glow, for it rose as faithfully as the moon, an unnatural star fixed over Coldwater Creek. No one dared ask Eliza why she kept it burning, though they longed to. The lantern had become a sign, a warning, and perhaps a prayer all at once, and the longer it burned, the more the neighbors understood that the Holloway house was not lit to keep darkness out, but to hold it within. It was the schoolteacher who found it first, a scrap of paper left tucked beneath the broken slats of the old fence near the Holloway road. She might have dismissed it as the careless scribble of any child had her eyes not lingered on the heavy strokes of charcoal that marked the page. The drawing was simple, almost crude, but its message clung to her with a chill that did not lift. At the center stood a rocking chair, its curved legs drawn too carefully, each line darkened again and again as if the boy's small hand could not stop tracing it. Beneath the chair rested a box, long and narrow, unmistakably a coffin, though no child should have known how to render it so true. The name, Samuel, had been scrawled at the bottom in uneven letters, pressed so hard into the paper that the marks cut through. The teacher folded the drawing quickly and hid it among her things, unwilling to let the other children see. That night she told her sister of it in whispers, her voice shaking as she recalled the sight of those two objects bound together, the chair and the coffin, as though one could not exist without the other. Word of the paper spread in quiet ways, from one set of ears to the next, until the neighbors began to recall other small things they had seen. A boy who had once played marbles with Samuel remembered how he sketched in the dirt instead, drawing squares and crosses instead of circles, and how his eyes grew distant, as if he were copying something he had already witnessed. A woman who had brought preserves to Eliza swore she saw a pile of drawings stacked neatly on the mantel, each one of a box, a grave, or a chair. None dared ask where Samuel had learned such images, for the answer seemed too heavy. Some claimed the drawings were warnings, others said they were confessions, the mute language of a boy whose voice had been silenced in his grandmother's house. The teacher, unable to rest, returned to the spot near the Holloway fence days later and found another scrap of paper caught in the weeds. This time it bore not a chair, but two small figures with hollow circles for eyes, lying side by side beneath what looked like the edge of a quilt. The quilt was stitched in red thread, drawn clumsily, yet clear enough to be understood. She burned this second drawing in her stove, but its shape stayed with her, curling in the smoke above her bed that night, as though the boy's hand had reached into her home. After that, the children of Coldwater Creek stopped whispering Samuel's name in games. They no longer dared to wander past the Holloway yard, for if Samuel still drew, he drew only for the eyes of his grandmother and for the shadows that leaned over his small shoulder, guiding the charcoal until the paper carried what words could not. The doctor arrived on a gray afternoon, his horse-drawn buggy creaking along the muddy road toward the Holloway place, summoned not by Eliza herself, but by a worried neighbor who had grown tired of unanswered questions. He carried his worn leather bag and the weight of suspicion, for whispers of the children's absence had wound themselves into every corner of Coldwater Creek. As he stepped onto the sagging porch, the lantern swayed, though no breeze stirred, and the rocking chair gave a slow groan, as if greeting him. Eliza opened the door before he could knock, her black veil lowered as always, her face pale and still as wax. She greeted him with courtesy, though her voice carried the finality of a closed coffin. "The children are resting," she said before he had spoken a word, her hand gripping the doorframe as though to bar his way. The doctor insisted gently, explaining that a child's frailty required a careful eye, that a fever left untended could burn through flesh like wildfire. Eliza smiled thinly, shaking her head. "I tend them myself. No stranger must disturb their peace." Behind her, the doctor caught the smell of herbs and something sour, something that made his stomach clench. He tried to press past, his professional authority urging him forward, but her hand remained fixed, and her body, though small, carried the immovable strength of stone. As he argued softly, he thought he heard it, a faint humming from within, a lullaby winding down the staircase, each note slow and heavy. He paused, listening, and for a moment believed he heard another sound layered beneath, like the weak breath of children trying to join the song. His chest tightened. "I must at least see their faces," he insisted, but Eliza's eyes rose to meet his, with such calm that he faltered. "Their faces are not for you," she whispered. "They sleep now, and they must stay sleeping." She closed the door before he could answer, the latch clicking into place with a finality that made his hands tremble. He stood on the porch, heart pounding, the rocking chair shifting in its slow rhythm beside him. For an instant he thought he saw movement in the window above, a flicker of pale skin, the outline of small hands pressed against glass, but it vanished the moment his gaze fixed upon it. He descended the steps with a heaviness he had not felt in years, his medical knowledge useless against the silence that clung to that house. Back in town, when asked, he claimed only that the children were too ill to receive visitors, but his words carried no conviction. At night he dreamt of the lullaby, the tune winding around him like a rope, and of two thin voices breaking off mid-note, swallowed by the creak of wood and the long hush that followed. The schoolhouse on the edge of Coldwater Creek was a place where voices should have filled the rafters, where the scrape of chalk and the shuffle of boots kept rhythm with the passing seasons. Yet two benches remained empty day after day, their wood polished not by use but by absence, the dust clinging to them like a veil. Samuel and Clara had once sat there, side by side, their small figures hunched over slates, their eyes wide and unblinking when called upon. Now their names were spoken only during roll, answered by silence that grew heavier with each passing week. At first, the teacher marked them absent with patience, telling herself the children were recovering from sickness, that the widow's care would restore them soon enough. But as weeks turned into months, her chalk hesitated at their names, the quiet between them stretching into something unbearable. The other children whispered about it during recess, their games taking them close to the Holloway house, only to retreat in fits of nervous laughter. Some swore they had seen Samuel's face at the window, pale as flour, watching them with an expression not quite belonging to a boy. Others whispered that Clara still hummed to herself in the night, her song drifting across the fields to those who dared to listen. Parents began to question Eliza, though none with courage enough to press. She would tell them the children were being taught at home, that their frailties demanded rest, and though her words were smooth, they fell like stones into the ears of those who heard them. The benches, however, told another story. Each morning the teacher found small marks upon them, faint scratches etched into the wood as though made by restless fingers. Sometimes they formed nothing but lines, but other times they curved into shapes resembling crosses or boxes. Once, she thought she recognized the outline of a chair, its rockers drawn with a hand that trembled. She scrubbed the marks away, yet they returned, always in the same place, always waiting when she opened the schoolhouse door. The children of the class grew uneasy, avoiding the benches as though they might catch whatever absence lingered there. Even the sunlight seemed dimmer in that corner, its warmth failing to chase away the chill that clung to the seats. The teacher prayed each night for their return, but deep within her, she knew the benches would remain empty, that whatever held Samuel and Clara now was stronger than duty, stronger than community, stronger even than the prayers whispered beneath the church steeple. In time, she stopped calling their names at all, her voice faltering as the silence pressed back too firmly. Yet the memory of their small bodies seated there remained, haunting her dreams, reminding her that absence could be louder than presence, that two empty benches could hold more fear than a room full of shadows. The women of Coldwater Creek gathered each Thursday in the back of the church, with their needles and thread, their hands busy, while their tongues whispered the news of the town. It was there that Eliza Mae Holloway sometimes appeared, quiet as a shadow, her veil lowered, her presence impossible to ignore. She carried with her folded cloth and spools of thread, and though she sewed with the same steady precision as the others, her patterns were unlike anything the circle had ever seen, where the other women stitched flowers, stars, or the simple beauty of fields and rivers. Eliza's quilts bore darker designs. Crosses stitched in red crisscrossed the fabric like markers in a graveyard. Small boxes, uneven yet deliberate, repeated themselves along the borders, their shapes unmistakably like coffins. One quilt in particular unsettled the women most, for across its center stretched a great rocking chair, its frame stark in black thread, its seat empty, but shadowed as though waiting for someone unseen. At first the women told themselves it was coincidence, a widow's way of mourning sewn into her work, but as Eliza produced quilt after quilt, the patterns grew harder to dismiss. Some swore the quilts whispered as they were unfolded, the threads pulling taut with a sound like breath. Others claimed the red stitching gleamed in the candlelight, wet as blood though dry to the touch. Eliza never explained her choices. When asked, she only said, "A quilt should tell the truth," her voice low, her hands moving without pause, the needles sliding in and out of the fabric, with a rhythm not unlike the creak of her rocking chair at home. The women grew uneasy, yet they did not stop her, for to confront Eliza was to feel her eyes upon you, dark and steady as if weighing your soul. Still, when the quilts were displayed at gatherings, the air in the room seemed to grow heavy, and children who saw them cried without reason, burying their faces in their mothers' skirts. One evening, after Eliza left early, the women unfolded one of her quilts to examine it more closely. There, tucked in a corner, they found two small stitched figures lying side by side beneath a red cross, their faces nothing but hollow circles. They folded the quilt quickly, their hands shaking, and no one spoke of it again. Yet the image clung to them, filling their dreams with visions of graves and lullabies that wound through the night air. From that time on, when Eliza entered the sewing circle, a hush followed her, and the women stitched with eyes averted, their laughter muted. The quilts themselves were warnings, though no one could say to whom they were given, and with each new one, she revealed, the women of Coldwater Creek felt certain of one thing. Whatever truth Eliza Holloway was sewing into her cloth, It was not meant to warm the living, but to cover the silence of the dead. It began with a sound that seemed ordinary, the slow groan of wood shifting beneath weight, a sound every farmhouse knew well. Yet when it came from the Holloway porch at dusk, it carried something more, something that made the hair on the necks of those who heard it stiffen. The creak of the rocking chair drifted across Coldwater Creek like a voice speaking without words, steady and deliberate, as if each movement marked the passing of something sacred and final. Farmers returning from their fields would pause on the road when the sound reached them, their hands tightening around lantern handles, their eyes straying toward the faint glow of the Holloway house. They swore the chair moved even when Eliza Mae was not in it, swaying back and forth in rhythm with a lullaby too faint to catch. Children dared each other to creep close after sundown, their hearts hammering as they clutched one another, and though most turned back before reaching the gate, a few swore they saw the chair shifting in the half-light, the boards beneath it groaning as if some invisible figure rocked in place. One boy, bold enough to hide by the fence, described the sound as endless, each creak sliding into the next until it seemed the chair would never stop. He told his mother that he heard whispers between the movements, low voices layered together, one belonging to Eliza and two belonging to children whose breath sounded thin and broken. His mother struck him for speaking such things aloud, but the fear in her eyes betrayed her. Even those who refused to believe could not deny the way the sound clung to the air, reaching beyond the Holloway porch into their very bones. It was said that on stormy nights, when thunder rolled and lightning split the sky, the creak of wood could still be heard beneath the chaos, unwavering, unshaken, as though the rocking belonged not to this world but to something deeper, older, unbothered by rain or wind. The pastor himself once claimed to have walked past after an evening service, drawn by curiosity and dread, and he confessed to hearing not only the chair, but the faint knock of something tapping against it, like a child's heel striking wood. He prayed louder than he ever had that night, his words swallowed by the sound of rocking that refused to yield. By morning, he told no one what he had heard, yet the lines in his face deepened, and his sermons took on a heavier edge, filled with warnings about sin and silence. The creak of wood became part of the town's nights, a rhythm too steady to be natural, too constant to be ignored. Those who lay awake in their beds could not help but hear it in memory, rocking through their dreams, reminding them of the children who no longer filled their benches at school, their pew at church, or the yard with play. The rocking spoke of absence, of lives cradled into quiet, and the more it sounded, the more Coldwater Creek believed that the Holloway house did not hold life at all, but something that mocked it, moving back and forth in the dark while the world watched in fear. The pastor had long carried unease in his chest when it came to the Holloway house, though duty compelled him to tend to all souls under his care. He had buried Eliza Mae's husband years before, had spoken soft words of comfort at the graveside while her veil hid a face that did not weep. Now, the absence of her grandchildren weighed on him as heavily as scripture, for the church was meant to cradle the living, not become a ledger of names, struck silent. One Sunday after service, when the last hymnal had closed and the pews stood empty, he saw her lingering in her usual place, her head bowed, lips moving with that strange rhythm he had grown to dread. He approached quietly, his hand tightening around the Bible pressed to his chest, and when he spoke her name, the sound seemed to fall flat in the air. Eliza raised her head slowly, her veil casting her face in shadow, and her eyes met his with the calm of still water. He asked her where Samuel and Clara were, his voice careful, not accusing, only heavy with the concern of a shepherd for lost lambs. For a moment she said nothing, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the skin thin and paper-like, veins blue beneath. At last she answered in a whisper, "They sleep now, and I keep them close." The words chilled him, not for their content alone, but for the reverence with which she spoke them, as if describing a sacred rite rather than the lives of children. He pressed further, asking if the children might return to the church, to their studies, to the company of others who longed to see them well. Eliza's lips curved into the faintest smile, though it carried no warmth. "They do not need company, they do not need lessons. They only need my prayers." Her voice grew softer, nearly a hum, and the pastor felt as though the walls themselves leaned closer to hear. He wanted to demand answers, to insist on seeing the children with his own eyes, but something in her gaze held him still, a calm that felt older than the pews, older than the steeple above. He realized then that her faith was no longer the church's faith, that her prayers bent not toward heaven, but toward something else, something dwelling in silence and shadow. He left her there, kneeling once more, her voice murmuring words that twisted against his ears. That night he could not sleep, for every time his eyes closed, he saw the image of a cradle rocking in the dim light of the Holloway parlor, swaying with a rhythm that matched her whispered prayers. He knew he should return, should press harder, should demand the truth for the sake of the children, yet fear coiled tight around him, a fear that told him the question had already been answered. The children were gone, but not gone enough, and Eliza Mae Holloway kept them in a place no sermon could reach. It was a pair of boys, restless with curiosity and the kind of reckless daring that only the young can summon, who stumbled upon what the rest of Coldwater Creek had feared in whispers, but never named aloud. One summer night, when the moon was swollen and the frogs sang loud by the creek bed, they slipped from their homes and crept through the fields toward the Holloway place. They had heard the creak of the chair too many nights, had seen the lantern glow when it should have been dark, and a dare between them grew into an oath neither could break. The grass was high, brushing their knees, and the smell of wet earth clung to them as they crouched near the leaning fence. The house loomed ahead, its windows black, except for one pale square of light upstairs. They did not dare the porch, but the barn stood open, its boards cracked with age, the smell of hay and dust drifting into the night air. The boys crept closer, hearts hammering, until their eyes adjusted to the dim within. At first they saw nothing but shapes of tools and shadows of rafters, the kind of clutter any barn might hold. Then their gazes shifted, and they froze as one. Two small chairs sat near the far wall, both gently rocking, though no hand touched them. Draped across each seat was a bundle, wrapped tight in quilts, stitched with red thread, the kind their mothers sewed but never with such grim care. The bundles were small, unmistakably shaped like children curled in sleep, their outlines fragile beneath the cloth. The boys held their breath, waiting for movement, for a hand to slip free or a head to turn, but there was only the slow sway of the chairs and the faintest sound of humming, so faint it seemed to rise from the wood itself. One boy's courage broke, and he grabbed his friend's arm, dragging him back from the open door, his breath loud in the stillness. As they stumbled into the grass, a shadow moved across the barn wall, tall and deliberate, as though someone had passed between the bundles and the lantern flame inside. They ran without looking back, their feet pounding the dirt road until their lungs ached, and when at last they stopped, gasping and pale, they swore to each other that they had seen Samuel and Clara still inside the quilts, though their bodies did not rise or stir. The tales spread in half-truths, told in whispers at school, and softened in the mouths of adults, but the fear remained sharp. Some dismissed it as children's fancy, a nightmare stitched from rumor and darkness, but others felt the truth in their bones. The Holloway barn was not a place of tools or feed anymore, but a chamber of rocking silence, where what should have been buried was kept above ground, swaying endlessly to the widow's unseen lullaby. The story of the boys spread quickly, carried from kitchen tables to store counters, from whispered gossip to the hard faces of men who no longer wished to pretend ignorance. Coldwater Creek was a place where troubles were kept behind doors, where neighbors nodded politely and did not pry, but there came a point when silence grew heavier than truth. That point arrived the night the bell was rung at the old town hall, summoning farmers, wives, and weary elders to sit beneath the flickering light of oil lamps. The benches creaked as the people gathered, their voices low, their eyes shifting toward the door as if they expected Eliza Mae Holloway herself to step inside. She did not come, of course, but her presence filled the room all the same, the memory of her black veil and the sound of her rocking chair echoing in their minds. The pastor stood first, his Bible clutched to his chest, his voice grave as he repeated what the boys had claimed to see. The two small bundles in the barn, the rocking chairs that moved without touch, the quilts stitched in red thread. Gasps and murmurs rose, some hands covering mouths, others shaking heads in disbelief. A mother wept softly into her apron, whispering the names Samuel and Clara as if they were her own. Yet not all were ready to condemn. Some argued that children's imaginations could twist shadows into horrors, that grief and rumor had turned a widow's devotion into a tale fit for firelight. Others spoke of the cradle, of the drawings, of the lantern that never ceased to burn, each piece forming a chain too heavy to break with simple doubt. The sheriff, a man slow to act and slower still to speak, finally rose, his hat in his hands. He said only that something was not right at the Holloway place, and whether it was sin, sorrow, or sickness, it could no longer be ignored. His words carried weight, for though he was not a man given to fancy, even he admitted he had heard the rocking chair in the dead of night when no one sat upon it. The meeting stretched long, the air thick with fear and the kind of anger born from helplessness. Some demanded they march that very night to the farmhouse and force the truth into daylight. Others urged patience, warning that to cross Eliza Mae too boldly was to invite curses older than any church prayer could lift. In the end, they chose a middle path, agreeing to confront her at dusk the following Sunday, when the lantern would surely burn and the hymnals would still echo in their ears. They left the hall with heavy steps, each face pale in the lantern glow, each heart beating with dread, for though they had resolved to act, none believed the act would end cleanly. The Holloway house had held its silence too long, and the town knew that once broken, such silence would not fade without demanding something in return. Dusk settled heavy on Coldwater Creek. The evening the townsfolk gathered their courage and walked the dirt road to the Holloway place. The air was thick with gnats and the smell of damp earth, the sky streaked in bruised purples as if warning them back. They came not as a mob, but as a small knot of men and women, the pastor at their front, the sheriff close behind, their steps slow with dread. Each knock of their boots on the road sounded too loud, swallowed almost instantly by the hush that always seemed to cling to the widow's house. When they reached the porch, the lantern was already burning, its flame swaying as though stirred by unseen breath, and the rocking chair gave a slow groan that froze them in place. The pastor raised his hand and rapped gently upon the door. The sound muffled, as if the wood itself resisted intrusion. For a long moment, there was only silence. And then, to their surprise, the door opened with deliberate grace. Eliza Mae Holloway stood framed in the threshold, her veil drawn, her face as pale as wax beneath it. She greeted them, not with suspicion or anger, but with a calm that unsettled them more than fury would have. "Come in," she said, her voice soft as the creak of the chair, and though every instinct screamed to turn away, they obeyed. Inside, the air was heavy with the mingled scents of herbs and smoke. Something sweet turned sour beneath the weight of the fire. The parlor was dim, the only light cast by the hearth, where the cradle still sat, rocking with a rhythm too steady to be chance. The quilts within it were folded neatly, the red thread gleaming dark as blood in the glow. None dared speak of it, though their eyes could not leave it. Eliza guided them to sit, her movements graceful, almost ceremonial, as if this moment had long been expected. She asked no questions of why they had come, for she seemed to know already. The pastor cleared his throat, his voice trembling as he asked after Samuel and Clara, pleading for reassurance that the children yet lived, that they might see them with their own eyes. Eliza tilted her head, and beneath the veil her lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. "They are resting," she said simply. "They rest always, and I keep them close." Her words fell like stones into the silence, and as she spoke, a faint lullaby drifted from the staircase above, soft and slow, winding down through the rafters. The townsfolk stiffened, their eyes darting upward, but none dared move. The sheriff's hand went to the brim of his hat, his face pale with doubt, while the pastor whispered a prayer too low to hear. They sat in that room with her, the cradle rocking, the song descending from above, and the terrible knowledge settling into their bones that whatever truth they had come seeking, it was already known, and it was far too late to turn back. The air inside the Holloway house seemed to close around the visitors like a fist, and just as the pastor gathered his courage to speak again, the sound drifted down the staircase, soft, deliberate, unbearably slow. It was a lullaby, though not one anyone in Coldwater Creek could name. The melody moved in circles, as if the notes turned back upon themselves, and the longer it went on, the more it pressed into the marrow of those who heard it. The townsfolk sat frozen in their chairs, their breath shallow, their eyes wide, for with every phrase of Eliza Mae's low voice came a faint echo, two smaller tones, like children trying to sing but faltering, their breath weak and broken. The cradle by the fire rocked with the rhythm of the song, its legs groaning on the wood, the quilts inside stirring, though no hand touched them. One of the women clasped her apron to her mouth to stifle a cry, her eyes fixed on the hearth, as if she saw shapes shifting beneath the folds. The sheriff shifted in his chair, his face pale and damp, but his hand did not reach for his weapon. Instead, he bowed his head as though to hide his fear, whispering words he did not believe. The pastor, trembling, tried to raise a hymn of his own, but his voice caught in his throat, strangled by the oppressive weight of the lullaby. It filled the room, not like music, but like a presence, seeping into the floorboards, sliding along the walls, pressing against their chests until it was all they could hear. One of the men swore he saw shadows move across the walls, small and quick, as though children played there, their forms outlined by the firelight, but when he looked closer, they lengthened, twisted, and vanished into the corners. The longer they listened, the colder the room became, their breath visible, though the fire burned bright. Still, Eliza swayed gently where she stood, her veil trembling with each whispered note, her body rocking as if she too were the chair, the cradle, the song itself. At last, the lullaby ended not with a final note, but with silence, so sudden it felt like the earth had stopped spinning. No one moved. The rocking chair gave a last groan and stilled, and the room seemed to exhale. Eliza lowered her head, her voice barely a whisper as she said, "You see, they are never alone." Her words broke the spell, but not the fear. The visitors rose as one, stumbling toward the door, their faces white as linen, too afraid to look back at the cradle or the staircase. Outside, the night air struck them like a baptism, yet the song clung to their ears, replaying in their minds with dreadful clarity. Not one of them spoke as they walked home, but each carried the same knowledge. The widow was not alone in that house, and the voices that joined her song had not belonged to the living for quite some time. It was a farmer's wife who found the ribbon, though she would later wish her eyes had passed it by. She had gone to the Holloway place with a basket of preserves, driven less by kindness than by the restless guilt that gnawed at every woman in Coldwater Creek. She paused at the gate, uncertain if she dared knock, when something bright caught her eye near the garden's edge. Kneeling among the weeds, half buried in the soft earth, was a strip of faded blue ribbon, knotted tight around a splinter of wood. At first she thought it no more than trash carried by the wind, but when she drew it free, she recognized the ribbon at once. Clara had worn it on Sundays, tied unevenly in her hair, fluttering like a small banner when she ran. The sight of it now, dirty and frayed, made her stomach twist. The wood it bound was not a twig as she had first thought, but a sharpened stake, smoothed at the top as though shaped with intention, the kind of marker placed at the head of something hidden. She dropped it back to the ground, her hands trembling, and hurried to leave the basket on the porch before retreating down the road, her heart pounding so loud she thought it might draw Eliza's eyes to her back. That night, unable to bear the secret alone, she told her husband, and soon the story spread in whispers. Some claimed the ribbon was proof of burial, that Eliza had laid the girl in her own garden and marked her grave with the only thing she had left of her. Others suggested it was a warning, a token tied by Eliza herself to keep curious neighbors from prying too close. A few whispered something darker still, that the ribbon was not a remnant at all, but a lure, left in plain sight to draw the living into the widow's circle of silence. The women of the town remembered the feel of Clara's small head beneath their hands when they braided her hair, the way the ribbon trailed across her shoulders, and the memory cut deep. Yet none dared confront Eliza, for fear that to speak Clara's name aloud in her presence was to invite something dreadful into their homes. The ribbon lingered in every mind, bright as blood against the soil, and when the wind rose through the trees at night, they swore they heard the flutter of fabric in the darkness, like a child running past unseen. From then on, mothers clutched their daughters closer, refusing to let them linger by the creek or stray too near the Holloway fence. The ribbon had once been a thing of innocence, a child's small adornment, but now it hung invisible over the town as a sign. Clara was no longer simply missing. She was marked, bound to the earth by her grandmother's hand, and the soil itself seemed to guard the secret as fiercely as Eliza Mae Holloway did behind her veil. The shoemaker of Coldwater Creek was a quiet man, his shop smelling of leather and oil, his days measured by the slow rhythm of hammer and nail. He remembered Samuel well, a boy who lingered at the doorway shyly, his eyes following the rows of boots and shoes as though they were treasures. The child's feet had always run ahead of him, worn through soles faster than his grandmother could keep pace. One autumn afternoon, long after Samuel and Clara had vanished from the schoolhouse, Eliza May appeared at the shop, carrying a pair of small shoes wrapped in cloth. They were Samuel's. The shoemaker recognized them instantly, the scuffed toes from climbing trees, the worn edges from restless pacing. She laid them on the counter with a finality that stilled his hands. "He will not need these anymore," she said softly, and her voice carried such calm certainty that he could not bring himself to ask why. He nodded, though dread coiled in his chest, and placed the shoes on a shelf behind him. When he unwrapped them later, he saw the leather cracked, the inside stained faintly dark, not with the honest dirt of play, but with something heavier that had sunk deep into the stitching. He told no one at first, but the shoes seemed to haunt the shop, their small shape catching the corner of his eye, their silence louder than the hammering of his work. At night, he dreamed of them tapping across his floor without a wearer, moving toward the door as if drawn back to their owner. In the following weeks, others in town noticed Eliza carrying no bundles to school, no small hand tucked in hers to church, and the story of the shoes spread like ash in the wind. Some believed she had surrendered them, as one surrenders a memory, casting off what the dead no longer needed. Others whispered that Samuel had not died in any natural way, that the shoes were offered as proof to silence suspicion. The shoemaker himself confessed to his wife one evening that when he touched the leather, he felt a chill in his bones, as though the boy's absence still clung to them. She urged him to burn them, but he could not bring himself to strike the match. Instead, he left them by the window, where the moonlight fell across them, two small ghosts of a life that had been. On nights when the lantern glowed on the Holloway porch, he swore the shoes shifted slightly, their toes pointing toward the road, waiting to be worn again. To see them was to know Samuel was gone, but not gone enough, his steps still echoing in the silence of the town, and so the shoemaker worked on, his hammer striking in rhythm with a heartbeat that was not his own, while the shoes waited, silent, accusing, a reminder that some journeys ended not in fields or play, but in the hollow rocking of a cradle that should have been laid to rest. On a storm-thick night, when the clouds sagged heavy over Coldwater Creek and the air smelled of iron, a neighbor swore he saw her, Eliza Mae Holloway, standing on her porch with the lantern in her hand. The light swung slowly, carving long shadows that bent across the yard like reaching fingers. Rain had not yet begun to fall, but the wind whipped her veil and stirred the hem of her black dress. She did not sit in the rocking chair as she always had. Instead, she stood tall and still, the lantern held out before her as though she were guiding someone unseen through the darkness. The neighbor, crouched behind his fence with his own lantern dimmed low, said he nearly called her name until he noticed what she cradled in her other arm. Against her breast lay two small shapes wrapped tight in quilts, their outlines too slender to be bundles of cloth, too distinct to be dismissed as trick of the eye. She rocked them gently, her body swaying in time with the lantern's swing, and though the wind roared through the trees, he heard her voice as clear as if she stood beside him. It was the lullaby, that wordless tune she carried everywhere, a melody that wound itself around his ears and pressed into his heart with a weight he could not bear. He staggered back, covering his mouth to keep from crying out, and the lantern on her porch flared suddenly brighter, pulsing as though in answer to his fear. For a moment he swore the quilt stirred, that tiny heads shifted against her chest, and he thought he heard the faint whimper of children too weak to wail. He turned and fled, stumbling through the wet grass until he reached the safety of his home, where he barred the door and fell to his knees in prayer. By morning, the story had already spread, told with trembling voices to those who gathered at the store and the churchyard. Some said the neighbor had seen grief made flesh, the widow conjuring ghosts to soothe her loneliness. Others insisted the children were never ghosts at all, that Eliza carried them still, bound in silence, lulled forever by the sound of her song. From that night on, she was no longer called simply the Holloway widow, but the Lantern Woman, a figure of dread, whispered about when the lantern glowed too bright in the dark. Parents warned their children to stay indoors after dusk, lest the Lantern Woman see them and carry them away in her arms. But what haunted the town most was not the story itself, but the truth it hinted at. If Eliza Mae rocked bundles against her breast, if voices faint and broken joined her song, then Samuel and Clara were neither fully alive nor fully gone. They belonged to her, bound to the lantern's glow, carried through the night by a grandmother who refused to let death finish what it had begun. It was the Miller boy who first heard it, for his room faced the Holloway place across the stretch of field where the grass grew tall and the wind whispered secrets. He had been restless that night, the storm clouds low and the air damp with the promise of rain, when the sound reached him. At first he thought it was the steady creak of the rocking chair, a noise so constant it haunted every silence. But soon he realized it was sharper, more deliberate, a shovel biting into earth. He crept to the window, pressing his face to the glass, and in the pale sweep of lantern light he saw her, Eliza Mae Holloway, her figure bent and swaying, each movement sinking the spade deeper into the soil of her yard. The lantern hung from a hook nearby, its glow restless as though stirred by breath. The ground was already heaped in mounds, dark against the pale grass, and with each thrust of the shovel, the widow paused to straighten her back and hum, the same lullaby that coiled through the town like smoke. The boy swore he saw her cradle something against her chest before laying it gently in the earth, though the shadows of the night made him doubt his eyes. His heart pounded so fiercely he feared she would hear it, that she would turn her veiled face toward him and beckon him nearer. He stumbled back from the window, pulling the quilt over his head, but the sound followed him, the scrape of metal against soil, the dull thud of dirt falling back into place, the hum that never broke. By morning, the yard bore the marks of her labor. The soil was turned fresh in long, uneven patches, dark and damp, as though rain had not yet fallen, but something beneath had soaked through. Neighbors noticed, though none dared mention it aloud. Some whispered that she was burying the children at last, laying them to rest under her watchful lantern. Others claimed she was unearthing them, pulling them from the grave to rock once more in the cradle by the fire. The sheriff was told, but when he rode out to the Holloway place, the earth looked settled, and Eliza greeted him with a calm that unraveled his questions before they left his lips. Still, the sound lingered in the ears of those who had heard it, the scrape and the hum, the lullaby that stitched itself into their dreams. From that night on, folk swore the yard changed with every storm. Fresh mounds appeared and vanished. The grass flattened in strange shapes as if by restless feet, and when dogs strayed too close, they returned whimpering, their muzzles damp with soil, their teeth stained as though they had dug at bones. The digging at midnight became another truth unspoken, one more weight upon the town's silence, a reminder that beneath the Holloway soil lay secrets that refused to stay buried, rocked to sleep and woken again under the pale glow of the lantern. After the nights of lantern light and the dreadful sound of shovels gnawing at the soil, Coldwater Creek braced itself for more, but instead came a silence that was worse than any noise. The Holloway place, once alive with the ceaseless creak of wood and the ghostly hum of lullabies, grew still. The rocking chair no longer moved, its legs fixed to the porch like roots. The cradle by the fire, glimpsed through the window by those brave or foolish enough to look, sat motionless, the quilts folded too neatly, as if waiting for something that no longer stirred. Neighbors, who had once strained their ears at night to hear the faint tune that crawled across the fields, now lay awake in beds heavy with dread, realizing that the absence of song pressed against them harder than its presence ever had. For the lullaby, strange as it was, had become part of the town's rhythm, a nightly tolling that reassured them the widow was still tending whatever she kept inside. Without it, the house seemed less like a dwelling and more like a tomb, its silence spreading outward, seeping into the air until even the crickets faltered and the owls no longer called from the trees. The pastor, passing one evening, felt the weight of that hush so fiercely that he nearly dropped to his knees, certain that the widow had finally laid her grandchildren in the ground, that the digging had been their true burial. Yet the silence did not feel like peace. It felt like a door closed and bolted, a presence no longer asking to be heard, but content to wait in shadows. The women who once stitched alongside Eliza noticed her absence too. She no longer came to the church circle with her quilts, no longer laid her hands to the red thread that told truths no one wished to see. Her black figure vanished from the roads, her veil no longer glimpsed in the pews. Some said she had shut herself inside with the children forever, locking the world away. Others whispered that she no longer needed to appear, that the lantern now burned for no one but her and the ones she kept close. The sheriff, pressed by the whispers, rode out one afternoon and knocked upon the door. But no answer came. The rocking chair was empty, the lantern unlit, the air still as a held breath. He lingered, his hand trembling on the knob, but something in the silence warned him away, and he returned to town pale and shaken, claiming he had found nothing amiss. Nights stretched on, and the Holloway house seemed to recede from time itself, fading into the quiet it exhaled. The absence grew heavier than sound, and the people of Coldwater Creek came to dread not the lullaby, not the creak of wood, but the silence that had returned to take their place. For silence was final, silence was absolute, and silence told them that whatever had stirred within those walls no longer cared to be heard, it only cared to remain. It was the youngest Miller girl who swore she saw it first, peering from her upstairs window on a night when the moon hung pale and swollen over Coldwater Creek. She shook her brother awake, her finger pressed to the glass, and together they watched the Holloway porch, where the rocking chair had stood unmoving for weeks. Now, against all reason, it rocked again. No lantern burned, no wind stirred, yet the chair groaned steadily, back and forth, as though guided by hands unseen. Word spread the next morning, and though most dismissed the children's tale as fancy, a quiet urgency stirred among the townsfolk. By dusk, a group of them gathered at the edge of the Holloway yard, drawn by the need to see what their eyes had long avoided. The house loomed dark, its windows blank, the soil in the yard marked with strange patches of grass that had grown uneven and pale. The rocking chair moved still, its rhythm slow and heavy, and with each creak the watchers felt the ground beneath their feet thrum faintly, as though the earth itself shared in the motion. Summoning a courage they scarcely believed was theirs, the pastor and sheriff approached the porch, their boots sinking into the damp wood. They paused at the door, exchanging a glance that carried all the dread of what they might find, and then the sheriff knocked, the sound hollow in the night air. Silence answered. He tried the latch, and to their surprise, the door gave way with a sigh, opening upon a room steeped in the smell of smoke, herbs, and something older, like soil turned too many times. The cradle by the hearth rocked in perfect time with the chair outside, though no fire burned to stir it. The quilts inside were folded neatly, and for a terrible instant it seemed as though the fabric itself swelled with breath. Then their eyes lifted to the figure, seated near the window. Eliza Mae Holloway sat upright in the rocking chair, her veil still covering her face, her hands folded in her lap. Her body swayed with the chair, her motions steady, but her skin had the waxen pallor of one long dead. The pastor stepped closer, whispering a prayer, and as he reached out, the veil slipped enough for them to see the hollowness of her eyes, the mouth fixed in a faint curve that was not quite peace. The sheriff muttered a curse and backed away, for though she rocked, it was clear she had no life left to move her. Something else rocked her, something that kept her swaying in time with the cradle, as if the chair itself refused to let her go. Outside, those waiting on the road heard the sound of wood groaning louder, faster, until it filled the night like thunder. And then, just as suddenly, the sound stopped. When the sheriff and pastor staggered back into the yard, pale and shaken, the chair upon the porch was empty and still, though the echo of its motion lingered in their bones. They told no one what they had truly seen, but the town understood without words. The final rocking had come, and it was not the widow alone who had been cradled in its rhythm. The morning after the final rocking, the town gathered in grim silence at the Holloway place, their faces pale, their mouths set in hard lines. The sheriff, pressed by whispers that would not rest, ordered the ground in the widow's yard turned over, for too many had spoken of digging at midnight, of mounds that shifted with each storm. Men brought their shovels, and though their hands shook, they struck the soil beneath the lantern's hook and by the barn door, where the grass had grown pale. The earth gave way easily, too easily, as though it had been broken and packed again many times before. In one spot, they found a scrap of fabric, a child's dress faded and torn, its edges stiff with age. In another, they unearthed a shoe, smaller than a man's palm, its leather cracked and brittle. But when they dug deeper, expecting what they dreaded most, the graves yielded nothing. No bones, no bodies, only the hollow scent of damp earth that clung to their clothes long after. Each hole they opened was empty, as though whatever had been buried there had risen or been carried away. The men worked until their backs ached, the women watching with pale faces and clenched hands, children huddled at the fence with eyes wide. Still, nothing but absence answered them. The sheriff threw down his shovel at last, his face gray with exhaustion and fear, declaring there was nothing left to find. Yet the emptiness was worse than discovery, for it confirmed what many already believed, that Samuel and Clara had not been laid to rest at all, that their grandmother had bound them to her rocking and her song, keeping them in a place no earth could hold. That night, as the townsfolk returned to their homes, a hush fell across Coldwater Creek, heavier than any storm. The Holloway house stood dark, the lantern gone, the chair unmoving, but its silence was not peace, it was waiting. For weeks afterward, folks swore they saw shapes at the upstairs window, pale and watchful, or heard the faintest hum on the wind when the night was still. The graves remained empty, and the memory of the widow's final rocking clung to every heart. The children of the town learned to run past the Holloway place with their eyes closed, clutching charms their mothers stitched into their clothes. And though years would pass, no grass grew thick in the yard, no laughter ever rang from its porch, and no soul dared set foot inside. Coldwater Creek carried the story like a scar, retold in whispers around fires, each voice lowering at the mention of the widow who rocked her grandchildren to sleep forever. Yet the question that gnawed at them most was not how she had done it, nor why. It was what became of the children, and whether their voices would always linger just beyond hearing, waiting to join the lullaby again when night fell and the world went still. If this story left you unsettled, comment the oldest town in your country, and if you want more tales that whisper long after the screen goes dark, like and subscribe to The Black Chapter.